What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Tuesday, February 16th. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, let's take a look at the point guard position. I'm going to give you a value play here. I like Alex Caruso from the LA Lakers playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Alex Caruso has averaged 14.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 19 minutes per game with a 14% usage rate. But he scored 18 and 20 fantasy points in the last 2 games, playing 19 and 20 minutes. He's projected at 20 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.3 times value. He's $3,800 FanDuel salary and $200 less on DraftKings. Vegas thinks there's going to be 223.5 points scored in this game. And Alex Caruso scored 9 and 33 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Timberwolves. So this is a high risk, high reward play, but his salary's low enough here. He doesn't need much to hit value, and he's got some pretty big upside based on that 33 points he put up. So I like Alex Caruso here versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, let's take a look at the point guard position. I like Ja Morant from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the New Orleans Pelicans, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Ja Morant has averaged 33.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 29% usage rate. He scored 28, 40, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 31, 35, and 30 minutes. He's projected at 35.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $7,100 FanDuel salary and $400 more on DraftKings. Vegas thinks there's going to be 230 points scored in this game. So we got a high scoring game, a fast paced game, and a great matchup. So I like Ja Morant here versus the New Orleans Pelicans. Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. So with CJ McCollum out, I like Gary Trent Jr. from the Portland Trailblazers playing the Oklahoma City Thunder, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Gary Trent Jr. has averaged 21.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. He scored 20, 31, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 35, 36, and 36 minutes. So you can see his minutes per game are up quite a bit from his season average, and he's projected at 27.5 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.7 times value. He's $5,800 FanDuel salary and $100 less on DraftKings. Now, he scored 28 and 50 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Thunder, so I think that gives him some pretty big upside for a relatively low salary. So I like Gary Trent Jr. here versus the Oklahoma City Thunder. Okay, another shooting guard that I like, the stud of the slate with no Kevin Durant in the lineup. I like James Harden from the Brooklyn Nets playing the Phoenix Suns, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing shooting guards. James Harden has averaged 50.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 38 minutes per game with a 26% usage rate. He scored 62, 60, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 35, and 35 minutes. He's projected at 48.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.4 times value. He's 11,000 FanDuel salary and 200 less on DraftKings. So I think he'll score at least 50 fantasy points here. Now, there is a word of caution. He is on a back-to-back, and in the couple of back-to-back games that he's played so far this season, hasn't really performed all that well, but there is no Kevin Durant in the lineup, which opens up a ton of usage. You see his usage rate was 34% last game compared to 26% average on the season. So that makes him a pretty good play here tonight, regardless of the back-to-back and regardless of the bad matchup. So I like James Harden here versus the Phoenix Suns. Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. I like Chris Middleton from the Milwaukee Bucks playing the Toronto Raptors, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Chris Middleton has averaged 37.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 32, 23, and 41 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 35, 37, and 35 minutes. He's projected at 38.8 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's 7,500 FanDuel salary and 500 more on DraftKings. Vegas thinks there's going to be 235.5 points scored in this game. So you got a super high scoring game, a fast-paced game, a good matchup. So I like Chris Middleton here versus the Toronto Raptors. Okay, now this next play is a FanDuel play only. I like Macau Bridges from the Phoenix Suns playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up, and they've been pretty good versus opposing small forwards, but Macau Bridges has averaged 27.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 33, 8, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 24, and 32 minutes. So he's somewhat of a volatile player. He's got a low floor and a high ceiling, and he's projected at 27.3 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's 5.2 times value because he's only 5,300 FanDuel salary, but he's 1,000 more on DraftKings. So this is a FanDuel play only for me, and Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 231.5 points scored in this game, and he's had some pretty good success versus the Brooklyn Nets, scoring 42, 23, and 35 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Nets. So I like Macau Bridges here versus the Brooklyn Nets. Okay, another small forward that I like is Brandon Ingram from the New Orleans Pelicans playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Brandon Ingram has averaged 39.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 35 minutes per game with a 28% usage rate. He scored 44, 45, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 38, 34, and 38 minutes. He's projected at 39.9 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.9 times value. He's 8,200 FanDuel salary and 200 more on DraftKings. Vegas thinks there's going to be 230 points scored in this game, so we got a high-scoring game. And Brandon Ingram has scored 58, 42, 36, 44, and 48 fantasy points in the last 5 games versus the Memphis Grizzlies. So that's excellent player versus team history. So I like Brandon Ingram here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. I'm going to give you a value play here, especially on DraftKings. I like Dario Saric from the Phoenix Suns playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Dario Saric has averaged 19.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 19 minutes per game with a 26% usage rate. He scored 11 and 37 fantasy points in the last 2 games, playing 15 and 19 minutes. Now, his last game where he only played 15 minutes was a back-to-back. It's not this game, and he's projected at 18.9 fantasy points here tonight. Now, on FanDuel, that's only 4.5 times value because he's $4,200 FanDuel salary, but he's $500 less on DraftKings. So I think that makes him a great DraftKings value play here tonight. And we know Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 231.5 points scored in this game. Great matchup. So I like Dario Saric, especially on DraftKings, here versus the Brooklyn Nets. Okay, another value play for you, especially on DraftKings. With Paul Millsap out, I like Zeke Naji from the Denver Nuggets playing the Boston Celtics, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Zeke Naji, he scored 23 fantasy points last game in 23 minutes with a 16% usage rate. He's projected at 16 fantasy points here tonight. On FanDuel, that's 4.2 times value because he's $3,800 FanDuel salary, but he's $700 less on DraftKings. So I think that makes him an excellent DraftKings value play here. If he's going to play over 20 minutes at only $3,100 DraftKings salary, he's the guy that's going to allow you to play a guy like James Harden in your lineup. So I like Zeke Naji here versus the Boston Celtics. Okay, moving on to the center position. I like Al Horford from the Oklahoma City Thunder playing the Portland Trailblazers, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Al Horford has averaged 33.2 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 42, 28, and 60 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 28, and 33 minutes. He's projected at 35.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.1 times value. He's $6,900 FanDuel salary and 100 more on DraftKings. Vegas thinks there's going to be 225.5 points scored in this game, and Al Horford has scored 29, 50, 33, and 35 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Trailblazers. He's got a good matchup in a fast-paced game, so I like Al Horford here versus the Portland Trailblazers. Okay, another center that I like is DeAndre Ayton from the Phoenix Suns playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing centers. DeAndre Ayton has averaged 33.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 19% usage rate. Now, he hasn't played all that well in the last 3 games. He's only scored 25, 16, and 23 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 26, and 29 minutes. But he's projected at 33.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.7 times value. He's $7,000 FanDuel salary and 100 more on DraftKings. So this is kind of a buy low opportunity here on DeAndre Ayton. And the reason that I like this pick is because his salary's low, and take a look at his last 3 games versus the Nets. He scored 56, 62, and 31 fantasy points. So, and we know Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. It's a great matchup. I think this is a game that he can get out of his slump, and you're getting him at a low salary with some big upside. So I like DeAndre Ayton here versus the Brooklyn Nets.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.